Hello, welcome to our stream today on National Grief Awareness Day. We are doing a number of sessions today to focus on grief and to honor the process that we all go through when we lose a loved one. Today at the 12 o'clock session, we're very, very pleased to welcome Karen Rogers. Karen is a death doula. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a degree from Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena, California, with an undergraduate degree in communications arts from Cal Poly University in Pomona. Karen is a Holy Fire 3 Reiki master teacher offering classes at Hospice of St. Louis, Obispo County, and treatments from her home studio. She has volunteered since 2005 with Hospice of St. Louis, Obispo County. She might have to actually make sure that I'm saying that properly. She began with Reiki offerings and trains as an in-home volunteer and as an end-of-life doula with INELDA, which is the International End-of-Life Doula Association. She has practiced as an end-of-life doula since 2015. Prior to starting her own business, including massage, Reiki, and psychotherapy, Karen Rogers spent 12 years as a marriage and family therapist for St. Louis Obispo Drug and Alcohol Services and in Los Angeles County for nonprofit agencies, including Los Angeles LGBT Center and the AIDS Service Center. Drawing on her many years of experience in administration, organization, and teaching, Karen now focuses mainly on volunteer work for hospice and as an end-of-life doula and coordinator for their Reiki program, both teaching and offering, as well as massage and training in aquatic integration, a water-based treatment modality. Her background has provided the perfect foundation for assisting others in finding their path. So with that, I'd love to welcome Karen to the stage. Hi, Karen.
Hi.
You were struggling there. You're going to have to say that for me the right way. How do you say that?
San Luis Obispo.
Thank you. St. Louis Obispo it is. I will never forget that one. All right. So we are just pleased and thrilled to have you here with us today. We're going to be sharing this session. We'll start off with a number of questions for you. We'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and some of the experiences that you've had. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end for our audience.
That's fine.
Perfect. So just because we started with your introduction as a death doula, will you explain to the audience kind of what a death doula does? And that will help sort of frame some of the questions we're going to ask and why your experience, why your advice sort of is colored by that experience.
Okay. I'm getting feedback on my side from you.
I think we're fine.
You're fine? Okay. I'll put up with it. So an end-of-life doula provides companionship, comfort, guidance to people who have a terminal illness or are approaching death. We have a non-medical holistic support, and it encompasses emotional, spiritual, and practical care. And I'm having notes because I want to make sure I don't miss anything, just so you know. We offer resources to help the dying person along with their family and loved ones. And we want to help people make informed decisions in a supportive environment. That help?
That definitely helps. Okay, so when you are working with a family or a person when they're transitioning, what are some of the things that the people that are still with the sort of survivors and people that are still living, how do they traditionally, are there traditional things that people do at the passing of a loved one? Are there certain rituals?
It's culture defined. It's spirituality defined. I've had situations where I learned Buddhist practices to be able to support a client and her husband who were active Buddhist practitioners. And in the later days, when she was confined to her bedroom, things had gotten a bit chaotic. And what I did was I reestablished the altar in her room and created sacred space, which meant putting away clothes and moving things that were extraneous to the process. So one of the things that I do is when I go into a situation as a doula is how do I create that sacred space for them?
How are they dealing with it though? Can you talk to me a little bit about how they might, are people typically in shock when someone passes? Are there certain types of characteristics or behaviors that you're used to seeing when someone passes?
Oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
It's a spectrum. It really is. Some people are calm with it. Other people are hysterical with it. It's very personal. And there's something called anticipatory grief, where people actually think they can practice grieving. It's like they know this death is coming, so they think maybe if they practice grieving, it will help. And actually, I did that when my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I thought that I could practice grieving so that when she died, I wouldn't grieve as hard. That was a complete myth and absolutely ridiculous, but it worked at the time, right up until the moment she died. And then I was just shattered. So we can't practice our grief. We don't know how we're actually going to be. In situations where I'm at a vigil, for example, which is usually in the last few hours or days of someone's life, people can be all over the map with how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. I was called in for a woman whose mother was dying, and all she needed was permission to lie down next to her mom and hold her in her arms as she was dying. A lot of times people are afraid to actually touch someone who has a terminal condition such as cancer or who is dying. And certainly if there's a lot of pain involved, that is wise to be very, very gentle and perhaps not do much touching. But human touch is how we share our love. And so it was so simple in that situation where she said, "Is it okay for me to lie down next to my mom?" And it's like, of course it is. Of course it is. And when I attended the protracted and very traumatic death of a 4-year-old boy, the entire family was involved. And everyone in the family had their own grief journey. Some were very emotive, and I would take them aside and they would talk to me. Others didn't want to talk. They wanted to remain stoic and in problem-solving mode. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. It's a very personal journey for every single one of us.
That's what I've heard over and over again, that it is very personal, and there's no sort of set way for someone to grieve, and we each have our own way depending on our personalities, like sort of how we deal with grief. One sort of term that is not often talked about in terms of the grieving process is relief. And in situations where you have a terminally ill person, maybe you've been a caregiver for 3 or 4 years for that person, and even though there's been a tremendous amount of love that is poured into that person, sometimes at the end there's a feeling of relief, and often that feeling is followed by guilt for feeling relief. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and this was even more profound during COVID, because COVID separated so many of us and kept people apart in the times when they most wanted to be together. What I experienced a lot of times was the guilt that came was, if I'd only known, I would have done this, I would have done that. And what I reiterate over and over again is, you made the best choices in the moment with the information you had. And now when you look back, you have more information, but you didn't have that then. And guilt is a part of it, but it's something that gradually people, I've noticed, have tend to let go, because while pain is absolutely a part of grieving, suffering isn't. Pain is natural. It's healthy. Grieving is healthy, but the suffering comes often when things are projected on us by other people, whether it's family or friends or colleagues or even well-meaning strangers who somehow decide that we need to grieve better because we're not grieving in the way they expect us to grieve. So that suffering comes also when we don't eat, when we don't hydrate, when we don't get enough sleep, when we spend too much time with toxic people or with people who just aren't good for us. I'm also a psychotherapist, and one time, one of my friends and coworkers, her husband died the day after their first baby was born. And she was phenomenally strong, and she was also completely in touch with her grief. And when she came back to work, there were moments when grief overtook her, and she'd step into her office and she'd bring herself together, and then she'd come back. And what happened was our coworkers, mind you, most of our coworkers were also therapists or social workers, were uncomfortable with her expressions of grief. And so they were recommending that she go on antidepressants so that she could function better. And she became understandably furious because she said, I don't want to numb myself. I loved my husband dearly. And I need to walk through this grief. I don't need to numb it down, because if I don't feel it now, it's going to continue to erupt when I don't have any sort of oversight with it. So people often are uncomfortable witnessing grief because, for example, they don't know how to hold space. And holding space is something that, as doulas, we do a lot of. And what that means is you're willing to walk alongside someone, whatever journey they're on, without judging them, making them feel inadequate, trying to fix them, or trying to impact the outcome. So when we hold space for someone, we open our hearts and we offer absolutely unconditional support and let go of judgment and control. So holding space is really a being place rather than a doing place.
And what if, do people typically feel comfortable in that space, like in a place where they're sort of holding space, or is that uncomfortable for some people?
It may be uncomfortable at first, and people generally have the opportunity to practice when we're there, particularly if I can take care of some of the quote housekeeping duties, like I can take care of the dishes, or I can take care of the laundry, or I can take care of preparing a small meal, so that the caregiver or the family members can just sit with their person. And a lot of times what happens is I will do something and then the family members will go, "Oh, we didn't think of that. Can we do that?" So I had a client who absolutely loved to be read to. She loved it. And her family was so busy taking care of her that they didn't realize that she really just liked to sit back and be read to and told stories. So I started doing that. And when they noticed that, boy, they all jumped on and said, "Oh, can I hold a book? Can I take over from you?" And I said, "Absolutely." So a lot of times it's almost as if people need permission to be okay with being around somebody who's dying. It's like they feel like there has to be drama and there doesn't at all.
So in terms of being in that space with someone, is there advice that you have for individuals that might have friends or family members that are still grieving, and they're in that space, they're holding space with that individual? Is there any advice that you have on what to say or what to do?
Well, one thing is to be aware that part of the grieving process, and I've worked as a grief counselor at hospice as well, part of the grieving process, part of the processing of that grief is to go over those feelings again and again. So I had clients, and again, this was during COVID when there was just so much helplessness. I had clients come in and say, I feel like I just keep telling you the same thing again and again, and you must get bored. And I said, no, you're not telling me the same thing again and again. You're going deeper with each retelling, and you're doing healing with each retelling of the story. And part of the grief recovery is the retelling of the story. And eventually, what happens is, in addition to the pain, a memory of joy will creep in to the storytelling. And often other emotions than grief will come to the surface. People are sometimes really angry that their person has died. I worked with a mom. She and her husband had adopted a girl, and the girl had bonded particularly strongly with the husband, with her new dad. And he died quite suddenly of a cardiac event. And mom was left not only grieving the loss of her life partner, but grieving the loss of the parent to whom their adopted daughter had bonded. And to overlay this, the mom had a previous diagnosis of depression. So for her, the grieving was compounded by frustration, by anger, by the depression. And one of the things that I addressed with her every time we talked was how she was feeling about going forward. Because when we talk about grief and the normalcy and the okayness with the grieving, you also want to be mindful when someone's grieving reaches a danger point. So if there's even a sense that they're using words like, I just don't want to go on, I want to join them, pay attention, be mindful of that, and be willing to take action, even if the person gets angry with you, because people have wanted to join their loved one. Also, expressions like that can be part of the grief process, but it's not something to overlook at all.
What do you recommend in those situations? What would you, if someone said, I don't want to go on anymore, I want to join, I want to be with this person in heaven or be with this person, what would the immediate next step, what do you recommend as the immediate next step?
Well, for me as a therapist, I'm trained. And so, I will ask, do you have a plan? And a lot of times people will go, what? No, I'm not going to kill myself. So that expression is actually an expression, just an expression of their grief. But if it's an elephant in the room, address it. Don't pretend it's not there. And if you feel that someone is a danger and they do say, yeah, I have a plan, I have this whole bottle of pills, or I have a gun, or I would do this, immediately call 911. Don't take chances.
That's great advice. So basically, if someone does say something like that, it is perfectly fine just to say, what is your plan? And to see what response you get back. That might make it, that might provide some clarity very quickly. Got it. Helpful. You mentioned anger a few moments ago. You were talking about anger sometimes at the person that passed, but there's also sometimes tension and anger amongst family members because people are grieving in different manners. Do you have any advice for individuals that are finding that their grief process doesn't look like a sibling's or a spouse's or someone else in the families, and they're being either criticized for it? I think you said earlier that they shouldn't be suffering, but they're feeling a lot of suffering because of the way other people are treating them. Do you have any advice for what to do in those situations?
I had this situation in a family where when their child died, the husband and the wife were grieving quite differently. Their paths for grief were quite different. And I worked with them briefly after the child's death to help guide them into grief counseling, because both of them needed to be able to process this, because it was not only the death of a child, but the traumatic manner in which the child died. And what I invited them to do, and what I do invite people to do when there are different paths for grieving, is to offer your partner or your sibling or your parent or your friend, offer them grace, and offer yourself grace in how you're walking through it. That your grief may not look like theirs, but that doesn't make it any more or less valid. So when, in this instance, when the child died, the husband, who had been extremely emotional and expressive during the dying process, during the transition process, his grief took the form of activity. And so he emptied out the garage and completely reorganized it and built shelves. And then he went in the house and he took the small extra bedroom and he converted it into an office and a study room to share with their other child, so that the two of them had their own space. Whereas Mama, who had been absolutely stoic during the entire transition process of her little boy, she was absolutely rock. She completely fell apart. She was totally fine with completely falling apart. And she found that being out in nature was where she felt the most healing. So she got a kayak and she went on a lot of walks and she went on a lot of bike rides. And when her son would join her, one of the things that they did to remember his brother, her other son, was when they'd go on a walk, if they found some stones, they'd take the little stones and they'd make a tiny pile, like a little stupa, and that would be their way of honoring and remembering her brother, his brother and her son in the moment. And I know a lot of people celebrate heavenly birthdays. You know, they still celebrate their person's birthday on their birthday and celebrate them.
So those are very helpful stories for us as we sort of think about how others might be processing grief in a way that's different than ours. You spoke earlier about the human, like the fact that grieving is just a human process, right? We all go through it when we lose a loved one. Are there things that the human body sort of has baked in to help you grieve or to help you release grief?
Well, our voice.
Yeah.
When my mom was diagnosed with the terminal cancer, I lived in LA. She lived up in the Central Coast, and it was a 4-hour drive. And I worked 4/10s. So I worked Monday through Thursday. And so Thursday evening, I would drive up to my mom's and I would drive home on Sunday. And my car became the holder of space of everything, because I wanted to be able to be calm with my mom and be centered with my mom. And we had one of those relationships where you say, oh, it's complicated. So I wanted to be my best self when I was with my mom. And at the same time, I had all these big emotions. So my car became the repository for my screaming, my yelling, my crying, my pounding on the steering wheel, all those things in my little insulated box, so that I discharged that energy. And by the time I got to mom's, I could be calm and I could take whatever she was throwing at me, because mom had a real challenge with accepting my support, while at the same time recognizing that she needed my support. She really wanted to be completely independent and take care of herself. And the reality was she wasn't able to. So there was really frustration and anger on her part. And I needed to be able to have my cup full, or have my emotional cup empty, so I could handle what she had to bring forward. So crying, we actually release chemicals and hormones when we cry that make us feel better. Going for a walk, going for a swim, doing something physical to discharge that energy, being out in nature, screaming at the ocean.
There's all I think we've all on our staff, we've all experienced some level of grief, and I think all of those different behaviors have we've all experienced all of those things: screaming, yelling, crying, all of those things in order to continue on with the journey of healing.
And if there's something that you didn't say, journal it or write a letter to the person so that you get it out and it's not spinning around inside your head anymore, that it's actually out there. Like, I was counting on you to walk me down the aisle. I was counting on you to hold your first grandchild. I was counting on you to, walk your graduation. So all those feelings can be dumped, so to speak, on a piece of paper. Or if you're someone who's creative and that's your expression, use art as a way to express your grief, whether it's musical or painting or knitting or whatever, collage, that you can use that grief and express it in a way that feels normal and healthy for you, because we do all have our own grief journey and we all have our own ways to process grief. And what can often be interesting is to, for instance, watch the way paintings evolve as you work your way through grief. They may be completely dark for months at a time, and suddenly there'll be just a light patch in the darkness.
I think that is great. Just a number of different things that you can do that are all sort of activities that allow you to express how you are feeling, whether it's art, whether it's exercise. I wonder, I know you and I spoke very briefly about volunteering. Sometimes when you show up and you start giving to others, even if you're feeling awful inside, just the act of doing something good for someone else actually helps you heal in a way.
It actually is. Distraction can be a wonderful way to handle situations. It does make us feel better to be in service of someone else. And so, I mean, as you might imagine, as doulas, we all have our own losses in our lives as well. And we have here in San Luis Obispo, we have a very strong family of doulas that supports one another. And we know that that's a luxury that we have this really strong family that when one of us is going through a loss, we are there to support and there to listen and there to raise a glass or to join in a memorial. So I just lost the thread. Sorry. Lost the plot.
I'll move along just for a moment. You just shared an example of a married couple and how they responded to their child when their child passed away. Um, Often there are situations where there are people that just don't know how to express their grief, and or they don't want to. They're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they feel like they need to exude some level of confidence and this I've got, the feeling of they have this all together and they're not losing it. And what do you say to those types of people that just don't want to allow the grief process to happen?
Well, interestingly enough, you can use the stealth approach. I just recently met a mother and son, but the mother's in her 70s, the son's in his 40s. And they had recently, within the past 4 months, experienced the death of her husband, very, very sudden death. And the son was being extremely supportive and extremely strong and really showing this absolute warrior outwardly. And I was talking with the mom, and my husband, who's also a doula, was in the shop where where the son was comfortable, was in the shop. And they were just talking about general things. And Steve just stopped in a moment and said, "How are you doing? really right now? How are you? And he said he just watched the shoulders just drop and say, and for him, the son to say, not great, not great. But I finally just signed up to get some counseling. So even those who are presenting that strong front, a lot of times they believe they're protecting somebody else. It's like we're protecting somebody from our grief. And that's often a time when I will say, okay, you don't want to talk to a family member because you feel like you're going to be burdening the family member who's already grieving. You're going to be burdening them with your grief. Okay, so find someone else with whom you can talk. And that may be a grief counselor. It may be a friend. It may be a therapist. It may be a teacher. But a lot of times that I need to be strong is around, I need to be strong so that I don't add to somebody else's burden. And although that is a myth, it's a really strong way of thinking. And so then I will say, okay, find that other person. And a lot of times that's a role that a doula will serve during that process. A lot of times when the family is all trying to be there for the person who's dying, but somebody is trying to be really strong, I will take them aside and say, okay, how can I help you? How can you work through this so that you feel okay going back into this situation, going back into the bedroom? And a lot of times just taking them aside for a moment and really acknowledging, I see you. I know that you're being strong and you're being really stoic for the sake of the family, but I need you to know that you are seen, and I know that you are feeling this as deeply as anybody else who's going through a box full of tissues.
And interestingly enough, sometimes the other family members are comforted by seeing that person grieve as well. They might think they need to hold it together for everyone else, but sometimes it makes everyone feel like it's just all right, and this phase just sucks. So, a quick question for you: when you are counseling people, is there anything that you usually start off with? Is like, how do you start off the sessions? How do you start off making that connection with someone if they're thinking about doing grief counseling and they've yet to do it and they're really struggling right now? What would you say to them?
What would you like to tell me? And sometimes it'll be a memory of the person. Sometimes it'll be, how they struggled at the grocery store. So it's like meet someone wherever they are. And there's no magic formula. There's no perfect entry at all. I mean, I've walked into a situation where the conversation started because I noticed a bell outside the front door and I knew the artist who had made the bell. And so when I went in and I said, hey, I noticed this outside. Can you tell me about when you got it? That opened the door to everything because that bell meant a lot to them. How they had acquired it meant a lot. And it turned out that they had a history with the artist. So it's just, there's happenstance and there's moments of divine timing. There's been many situations where someone will say, it meant so much when you said this or when you did this. And I will have no memory of having said that or done that specific thing because I was in the moment and just responding to what I was feeling or sensing in the moment. And that comes of practice and it comes from intention.
At this point, we'll open up for questions. If there are any questions that you have for Karen, we'd be happy to have her answer them. So you can just go ahead and place them in the chat. Let's see what we have here. No questions yet, but if there are any questions that you have for her, if you or yourself are dealing with someone who is grieving and you're unsure how to approach with them or interact with them, this is a great time to ask Karen if you yourself are dealing with grief and it is a process and you're not understanding what's going on, or it's taking a little bit longer than you would like, or you would hope, or you would think it might take. This is a perfect time to ask Karen as well about that.
While we're waiting for questions, we've talked a little bit about ritual. You and I talked about ritual in our previous call. And for COVID, obviously we were separated and a lot of the traditional rituals couldn't be followed. And my sister-in-law, when she lost her mother and her mother was cremated, her brother had the cremains. And the plan was for the family to get together to scatter the cremains. And her brother made a unilateral decision without notifying anybody else in the family of disposing of the cremains himself. And she had so many emotions around this because she had planned what she was going to do. She was going to take a rose, her mother's favorite red rose, and they were going to scatter the ashes at the beach as a family, the siblings. And all this was robbed by the one brother deciding that he was going to do it his way. And she kept ruminating over this. And she was so angry and she was so sad and so disappointed. And finally, I said, it sounds like the roses were something really special between you and your mom. And she talked to me a little bit about that. And I said, well, why don't you plant that rose outside in your front yard, maybe by the front pathway on the way to the door, so that every time you enter or leave your house, you see that symbol of the love you had for your mother and the love that your mother had for you. So you've got your own ritual, your own memorial that belongs to you for you, that nobody can take away.
I'm assuming that went over well, and my hunch is she has a memory every single time she walks out of her door or walks into her home.
It did, and it was all about me. I had to listen to the kind of recirculation of the anger and the grief and the processing over and over until I felt like the time was right for that seed to be planted. And then I only told her once. I didn't tell her more than once, because once you planted the seed, just let it germinate. And one of our doulas has a special place in her garden. It's a little tiny corner of her garden. And for every client, she has the client's name painted on a stone and a symbol of what they meant, or a symbol that represents them. So it's a private corner of her yard. Nobody else sees it. And it's her own little memory garden.
That's beautiful. Are there any other creative ways that you have heard about or given like advice on how to create sort of a way to continue memorializing your loved one after they've passed?
One of my families, a year after the death, they dedicated a play area with equipment in the park where a lot of the local children play and where their child used to play. One of my clients was a lifelong musician, and part of her legacy was her autobiography, her final CD, and an art piece of where she visualized her next step would be after death. And so after she died, her husband set about getting the book published. And her CD, we finished post-production on her CD just before she died. So she had actively said, this is what I'm setting out there to remember. And again, a year after she died, she had created and moved forward with music camps, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, that were annual. And she was a mother by proxy for musicians who are not always supported in their creativity. And so she was a mama to many, a musical mama to many. And at her memorial service a year after she died, a lot of the musicians spontaneously got together, and after the formal part of the ceremony, they performed songs that they had written for her or told stories about what had happened because of her unconditional love and her nurturing their talent and their gifts and their joy, that they were able to take the steps that other people had criticized them. And she had said, no, this is your joy. You need to nourish it however that looks. And so it's like her legacy was so much more than the book or the CD. Her legacy was that spark of love and light that everyone that she touched carried with them. And that's something that we need to remember as grievers, is that we carry that spark of love and light in us of that person. And I tell you, there's still times when I'll sit with something and I'll call upon someone who has transitioned and say, what would you do in this situation?
Nice. Well, first of all, do you hear back? Do you actually feel like you hear back and get advice?
I get down.
Karen, I'm going to try and see if there are any other questions. Are there any other questions from the audience? We'd be happy to ask Karen at this point. If so, please feel free to place them in the chat area. And Karen, while we're waiting, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience? Anything that we may have missed? Any advice that you'd like to lend, especially for those people that are going through a significant amount of grief at this stage?
Talk it out. Cry, pray, meditate, create. If you need to take a break from school or from work, do that if you can. Take time for yourself. And that may not be an extended vacation, but it may be that you take a certain amount of time each day to honor and dedicate to your grieving. Because, we're expected to go on and live our lives and do our thing and take care of the kids and take care of the house and work our jobs and all that. In addition to being completely overcome with grief. I know that my mom died suddenly, but not unexpectedly. And then 6 months later, my dad died quite suddenly and quite unexpectedly, completely. And I literally could not hold the grief for both of them at the same time. So I kind of put one on the shelf and then just immersed in the grief for the other. But what happened was I was functioning. I was a therapist at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center at the time. I was working a 40-hour week. I was functional. But there is a huge gap in my memory. And I know that gap is because I was grieving. And we need to recognize that a lot of times in our grief, we are not in our right mind. We may be functioning. We may be able to completely function in our lives and take care of all the business that we need to take care of and pay the bills and feed the kids and walk the dogs and do all those things. But grief is really an altered state. And we need to be mindful of that it is an altered state. You're muted.
Oops. So we talked about sort of self-care during this altered state and the importance of hydration. I think people forget that. We always talk with our clients about the importance of making sure that they stay hydrated, namely because the body is really working hard during this process of grief. Often you're crying a lot and you just need to be replenishing your body. Are there other things that you would speak to that you would offer as advice of things to do for self-care?
Well, the hydration is good one. It's not just about crying, though. It's about sort of literally going with the flow, because you're every time that you drink, you have to pee, and and that's letting things go. And you don't want to hold things static in your body. You want to allow them to flow. So moving your body, getting fresh air. And if you do find yourself falling on the darker side and thinking suicidal thoughts, 988 is the suicide and crisis hotline. The crisis text line, you text home to 741-741. The Trevor Project for LGBTQIA plus and under 25 years old. Veterans Crisis Line, Deaf Crisis Line, Befrienders Worldwide. I think I sent all those for you to have as resources with BlueButterfly, but it's definitely something to know your resources. And as someone who's supporting someone else in grief, be aware of the resources you have in your community. And if you don't know who to reach out to, find out. Find somebody who does. You mentioned, we haven't talked about it, but we talked about Death Cafe. So at Death Cafe, people, mostly strangers, gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death, is how they phrase it in Death Cafe. And Death Cafe went virtual during COVID. And now, while the Death Cafe does take place in person, it also continues to take place virtually. And Death Cafe is a place to increase the awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their lives. So it's a group discussion with no agenda, objectives, or themes. It's a discussion group versus a grief support or counseling session. So having said that, so Death Cafe is at, I think, deathcafe.org. You can look that up. But also check with your local organizations, your local hospices, to see if there's a grief support group, spouse support group, suicide support group, a caregiver support group, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's support group. Look to places where others are in that experience, and you won't feel judged or different because you're all around a circle, each on your own journey, but recognizing that sometimes what you have to say can really make a difference for somebody else. And that's another place where we talked about being of service can help us in our own process. You know, when you're a year away from a death and you're in a support group, your year away from that death can help somebody who is just stepping into grief to show them that things will change. You're not going to get over it. We're never going to get over it. We get through it. And so your participation as somebody who's been through it, survived the gauntlet, been battered and broken and bruised and made it out the other side, you can give hope to someone who's just walking through that door and going, I have no idea how I'm going to continue my life without this person.
That's really helpful, Karen. Thank you for those words of wisdom and advice. We do have one question that has come up. We have a person who's asked, what advice do you give, or do you have if someone feels guilty about grieving months, even years later?
My mom died in 1998, and there are still moments that I am caught completely unaware and will burst into tears. Because, you know, people say, oh, you'll get over this. You won't get over it. You'll get through it. And if you find that your grieving is getting in the way of you living your life, seek help, seek support, whatever that might look like. But to have somebody else make you feel guilty is about them, not you. It's about, a lot of times, you know, as I said with my coworker who was advised to take antidepressants so that other people could be comfortable around her. It's like, no, we all have this freedom and this ability and this responsibility to grieve, because grief is proof of love. And we still, even though that person is no longer here, we still have that love. And so when you talk about feeling guilty for grieving, okay, how can you transform that guilt? How can you transmute that guilt? Does it mean that you start creating? Does it mean that you start helping in, an organization? Does it mean that you go work in a garden? Find a way to transmute that pain and that guilt. It doesn't serve us. That's where I talked earlier about pain and suffering. The pain is natural. The suffering is optional.
Well, Karen, this has been extremely helpful. I am sure there are many people who will benefit from the advice that you've shared today. If they would like to follow up with you specifically for counseling, how can they reach you?
I think my phone number and my email are in the chat. And I can help people if you're kind of in an absence of resources. I'm a pretty good resource seeker outer. So if you even want to call me and say, who do I reach out to? Where do I go? Then feel free to do that.
Well, Karen, we just want to thank you so very much for taking this time with us today. Again, I know you have been a blessing in many people's lives today, and you've been very helpful. And they'll take these words of wisdom with them as they continue to go through their own personal journey with grief. At 1 o'clock, in just a few moments, we have the next session that will begin. It will be how to cope with the loss of a parent. And we'll be talking with Tara Accardo, who's also a grief coach. She'll be talking with us about specifically what happens when you lose a parent. So we ask you to stay on. We'll be back in about 8 minutes, starting that new session. And before we go, Karen, just want to say thank you again. If you would like to, many of the resources that Karen mentioned are now in the chat. And if you'd like to reach her directly, you can call her at 805-234-5998, or you can reach her at email, and the email is in the chat room as well. Okay? Thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.